Welcome to a demo of how to do a still life in graphite, one approach anyway. You will notice some discrepancies between the thumbnail and the photo. This is in part a recreation of a partially completed demo from half a year ago, so I don't even have the same table anymore, so I can't work from the same angle. But the important thing to note is that I was able to recreate the general value relationships that are going on. And if you look at the thumbnail, there's an absolutely tiny version on the right that shows just the contrast between the main lights and the darks. The larger thumbnail at the bottom shows a 3-value system of where the lightest lights are versus the middle grays and then the darks. This was how I was feeling out whether I would be able to get a satisfying full value range in my drawing and what sort of shapes they would occupy on the page. I was trying to look at the negative shapes of the darks as independent of meaning as wood or background. And the background is important in this. For a still life, you get a profoundly different feel if you stick it in the advertising void of nothingness around it. All of your values only have meaning in relationship to their context, so you have to consider whether your subject is lighter, darker, or similar to the background in value. This part is familiar to anyone who's had drawing classes with me. I just started out with a 1-inch border on all sides, and what I'm jumping straight into is using light, what I call cobweb lines, to intuitively feel out the various shapes on the page. What you cannot see, because I chose to use a screen recording in order to avoid obscuring my drawing with my hand, is that I am holding my pencil as a measuring tool up to what I am looking at frequently. This X that I have marked is the width of the mug. The width of the mug, that is to say, the diameter of the mouth of the mug is similar to the diameter of the cylinders of the toilet paper. Yes, I thought I was very funny when I set this up the first time. But what is important is that gave me a frame of reference to decide what scale to draw all of the objects in this, because I knew that the mug was X units wide, and that meant that I could compare it to the relative height to width of this drawing, this picture plane that I had set up. And you can see that I'm jumping straight into really feeling out where what the shape of that ellipse is. I have divided it into quadrants and then divided the corners in to give myself as many reference points as possible, and I'm rotating my my picture plane just like you can rotate your paper in order to try to avoid pinching any of the corners of this ellipse. And I am doing a combination of drawing the lines and erasing them. I'm treating them almost like shapes more than I am like lines. That's partially because of the width of the tool I was using, and partially because I find that gives me better results. Now it looks like I have decided that I'm reasonably comfortable with the shape of the mouth of that mug and the relative height to width of the mug, and am continuing with the intuitive lines to feel out where everything is. I have an advantage because I've already done this drawing to about a halfway mark, so these are, with small modifications, very familiar shapes to me. Remember, I said that the diameter of the toilet paper rolls was equal to the diameter of the mouth of the mug, so I've been able to give myself a head start there as well. I just have to figure out how much they are indented as they overlap one another. I'm keeping my lines relatively light in the hopes that when I begin to add value, the lines will just get swallowed up in the drawing as a whole, because one of the goals for this drawing is to express this still life purely through the element of value rather than line. I'm using lines arguably as a bit of habit, but they are marking the boundaries of areas of value. And so that is why you have those curved lines in the back. Those are going to be shadow shapes. There are a couple of pieces of wood in the background that overlap, which is what that vertical line is. And now I am trying to add, it looks like I'm struggling a little with my tool, but now I am going to start adding in just the mid value and darker for everywhere. So I'm not going to bother to differentiate between what is a dark value, what is a black, what is a mid value. I am just looking at every part of this drawing and saying, okay, if it's lighter than middle gray, I'm going to leave it alone. If it's middle gray or darker, I'm going to give it a middle gray value. And I do that everywhere, using my eraser sometimes to adjust the relative shapes of them. And I find that by simplifying the number of variables that I am balancing at any given time, it allows me to be just a little bit more sensitive to the relative shapes. I'm looking at things like, what is the no-name negative shape that is formed in the space between the top of the rim of the mug and the change of angle in that toilet paper roll from the side to its top. What is that weird little scalloped shape that is formed at the base of the mug and the toilet paper rolls? Next, I'm going to switch very briefly to a photo that I took in progress on the previous demo version of this. So it's actually in graphite. The texture will slightly more closely approximate what you'll get. And you can see how there's some areas of scratchiness, but broadly, it's pretty smooth. And here we are back to the digital. I'm going to begin separating out that large zone that I've defined as the middle grays in opposition to everything lighter than middle grays. I am going to start subdividing the middle grays into middle grays versus, it looks like I've jumped straight to black because that makes sense. I spent a lot of years oil painting, and that builds that habit in you. But still, you see how I have slightly fewer decisions and slightly less searching to do because I know broadly where these darks are going to go. Occasionally, I will have cause to question my prior decisions about where the lightest values were. But for the most part, this has given me enough structure to find where the value is that are darker. I should mention I have sped this up by at least 2 times. I was working at a fairly leisurely pace, but I didn't feel like there was any pedagogical benefit to making anybody watch it at the actual speed that I did. Just thought I'd mention that I'm not quite this fast. This is one of my favorite parts of doing this kind of drawing, is just moving my eyes back and forth and taking an all-over approach and trying to see at any point, is this dark? Is this particular inch of space that I'm looking at as dark as the place next to it? It's just this constant reassessment that is somehow meditative for me. Hopefully it is for you as well. It is about time to switch back to the graphite demo that I made last time around. It has some more detail than I was able to accomplish in this. You can see where I'm beginning to use value to separate out layers. There we go, to separate out layers of the paper as it wraps around the roll. But here we are back again. It's broadly similar relationships. One of the things that I am searching through here is a particular favorite of mine, which is to see how the relationship, like that shadow shape where the 2 boards in the background overlap, it continues even when the cast shadow of the toilet paper lands on it. Similarly, the shadow cast by the mug on that little bit of, it's actually a torn bit of layer of plywood, but there's always a slight relationship of that which is dark gets a teensy bit darker where that shadow overlaps it. And this is just truly more of the same, seeking out the shapes, finding excuses to erase a little bit of detail here and there. Eventually, I'm going to get around to noticing that there is a weird shadow shape between the 2 rolls of toilet paper, and I'm going to do something about that because it was actually a lot more subtle than that. But one of the things that is really important at this stage is to consider which edges need to start getting harder. That is to say, a more abrupt contrast between light and dark values, and which of them needed to be softened, either by I'd like to suggest not smudging it with a smudge stick because that makes it just very hard to erase later. I, by preference, will add a little bit of value on either side of something, a transition that is too abrupt, or conversely, taking your kneaded rubber eraser and just pressing it down, holding it, and then lifting it up to just take a little bit of graphite out without disrupting the texture of the paper. Those are my personal preferences at this stage for adding detail. Yep, teasing out a little bit of value. If there's a plane where you can find an excuse to be sensitive to a slight variation on it, it makes the overall artwork more interesting, especially since we know with the light source so close to these objects that the flat surface upon which they rest is it's being affected by the light as well. It's not going to be the same illumination all over. And that relates to something I was trying to mention earlier in this video, which was that for this particular project, as I'm defining it, the value of the relative values of the subject are kind of meaningless unless they happen in the context of an environment in which light is also being cast. So you really should try to find areas for value to go on there. Oh, and here I am trying to get rid of the initial outlines of the margins, in some cases by erasing and lightening them, and in some cases by teasing a little bit of value out. Yep, there we go, trying to have it swallow up some of the lines. I might have gotten a little carried away. And there we go. Finally, I eased up the transition between those two rolls of toilet paper just a little bit. I'm not sure why this is zoomed in a little bit, but at the very end I'll include just the image so it's not cropped oddly as it is right now. Yes, I see I chose to exaggerate a little bit the value between those two panels so that we could see that they are separate, there's a bit of depth, however slight, between them. Some little tiny special shadows. Those are fun. And here is hopefully the finished drawing. I hope that helped.